In the Reserve Bank's opinion, is the current fiscal policy expansionary, restrictive or neutral?
Our assessment is that it's broadly neutral. If you take the federal government and the state governments together, which I think is the best way to think about it, the budget deficit's a share of GDP around 3%, and it's likely to stay around that mark for the next few years. The federal budget deficit narrows a bit and then widens, and the states are doing the reverse. So the best way to think about whether fiscal policy is contractionary or expansionary is to look at the change in the aggregate budget deficit, and over the forecast period there's little change in the budget deficit as share of GDP. So I would describe it as neutral.
Shouldn't it be contractionary if inflation is at the level that it is today?
I'm not going to comment on what the government should or shouldn't do. The Treasurer doesn't comment on what I should or shouldn't do, and so I'm not going to comment on the direction of fiscal policy. I can make kind of perhaps one general observation, is that at the moment aggregate demand growth has been too strong, and interest rates are part of the way that we bring that back down again. Interest rates are a nimble policy tool. They're a blunt policy tool, but they're nimble. The Reserve Bank Board meets every month, and we can take decisions every month based on the flow of information. The received wisdom over recent time is that fiscal policy, most of the time, is not as effective as managing the cycle. Because if you're going to have fiscal measures introduced, it has to go through the House of Representatives, the Senate, and that takes time. So and I broadly ascribe to this view that fiscal policy most of the time should be dealing with the structural issues and structural budget position, and except for in extraordinary times, it's not the best tool to use to manage aggregate demand. Interest rates, for all the faults and all the problems we have, is the more nimble tool.
Can I just clarify, when you say that fiscal policy is neutral, in your opinion, does that mean that it's not assisting to bring inflation down?
I wouldn't characterise it that way. Really, again, depends upon the counterfactual. The government has got a lot of extra revenue because of the high commodity prices, so if it decided to spend that now, that would have been problematic. So we welcome the fact that the government has decided to save most of the extra revenue there. There are other elements of fiscal policy that can help as well. The government's energy package, our estimate is that the price caps there will reduce inflation in 2024 by 0.5 percentage point. That's meaningful, so that's helpful. So the government can take measures in specific parts of the economy that have an effect on prices. The other thing it can do is to free up the supply side of the economy. If there's greater competition, more investment, more freedom on the supply side of the economy, then the price pressures in specific areas for any given level of aggregate demand is going to be less. So specific measures in particular industries, flexibility on the supply side and aggregate demand, they're the three tools the government has to affect the inflation outcomes, and it's really up to the government and the parliament to decide what combination of those tools they use.
So as a rule of thumb, do you believe that fiscal policy and monetary policy should be aligned?
In general, yes. I mean, but you know, fiscal, as I said, fiscal policy has not just doesn't need to be worried just about management of the cycle. There are structural issues that we need to pay attention. I think in previous hearings in this building, I've talked about the importance of maintaining medium-term structural budget integrity. There are huge demands on the public purse, as you know, and we need to find a way to meet those demands if we want to, and the answer isn't borrowing. So that's the kind of first-order issue for fiscal policy, and over and above beyond that, it's helpful if monetary policy and fiscal policy aren't working in opposite directions, and they're not at the moment.
Can I ask, just first of all, you mentioned before that, and which I thought was very generous of you, that you don't comment on government's decisions as part of its fiscal policy and what the government should do. For first of all, may I ask, is there anything specifically around that structural deficit that you would like to see the government doing?
Nothing specifically right at the moment, but we've talked before in these hearings about the importance of having a strong budget position in the medium term, because at some point in the future we'll have another downturn and we'll want the government to be able to respond, and you can only do that if the budget is a strong structural position. And my observation, and the observation of others, is there are a lot of demands on the public purse coming from health, ageing, defence, disability, education. The society wants the public sector to provide these things. If the governments want to do it, they need to find a way of paying for it, and that way isn't debt. So the best outcome, as we talked in previous hearings about, is to make the pie bigger through addressing the supply side. So that's what I would, in broad terms, that's what I would like to see over time, efforts to make the pie bigger so that the demands on the public purse can be more effectively met. But that's not affecting kind of right now, but that's what I'd like to see in the medium term.
So I get a sense there that your views are aligned with those of the IMF, that those large off-balance sheet funds can potentially be inflationary, can potentially cause debt to rise, and that would make your job that bit harder.
Well, they can add to aggregate demand, and we take that into account in our forecasts. They can also increase the supply side of the economy over time. So this is, I think, probably part of the government's intention, that these funds are used to address supply side issues. So in the medium term, that can, if these policies are wisely conducted, make the pie bigger. And making the pie bigger helps us all.